There have always been challenges, particularly with investing in infrastructure in Africa. There are challenges around the business climates in the countries that you're trying to operate in. There are challenges around the fact that often the people you're interacting with don't have much experience of dealing with these projects. You know, when you're doing a project that's the first project in the country, by definition, people don't have experience in dealing with them, which makes the negotiations and the preparation of the projects, you know, that much more difficult.
Africa has anywhere between $90 to $120 billion of infrastructure funding gap, and that is apparently just to almost maintain a status quo. The irony of the situation is, whilst Africa has an infrastructure funding deficit, the flip side of that is that the funds that has been raised for Africa, be it for infrastructure or be it PE generally, is having difficulty finding investments, right? So it's almost like a contradiction, that on one hand you need more money, on the other hand you have the money that you need, but you're not being able to deploy. And therein lies the answer to your question, that the biggest challenge is not so much the funding gap, because that is a challenge, but more a case of how do we mobilize and motivate and manage the various political agendas across the continent for viable large infrastructure projects to happen. Most African countries, you must remember, are individually pretty small, and therefore the critical mass that is required for any large infrastructure project to be viable typically and usually always requires cooperation between countries and between regions. If you can get regions and countries to collaborate more with people like us and work towards a common end, then I think the infrastructure gap that Africa is facing will be addressed much faster.
Is that if you do have the levels of infrastructure deficit you have in the continent, we are not going to have the kind of GDP growth, that sustained GDP growth that we need in this continent to get to some level of development until we address those issues. So I think the opportunities are massive. What you've got to do as an investor in this space is that always look at the conditions that's open to you, look to see how you can interact with government, because they're all government regulated sectors, and look to see where you can structure things that will make it work and to safeguard your investments, provide an infrastructure base, but also give a return, an adequate return to your investors. How do we begin to have standardization in terms of market terms, in terms of documentation, in terms of the structuring practices that we use? Can we have a forum where we can get all of these developers, financiers, all of those involved in infrastructure development in Africa and financing in Africa to come together and have a forum that we can actually share ideas, share our experiences, and actually begin to put in place common templates.
We think that initiative to sort of try and standardize and bring together project development will help really to accelerate the sort of projects that are coming on stream across the continent, which obviously will have a big benefit going forward.
We see this particular vehicle, or these vehicles, being, if you like, a channel for capacity building and building talent across the continent.
No, you can't just transplant an idea that has worked in Europe or the Americas and expect it to work in Africa. The advantage that we have in AFC is that we have the people who know Africa. So we've been able to address some of those challenges and overcome some of the obstacles that, you know, an outsider would otherwise encounter.